Good evening, everyone. I'm Karen Carpwich, the Executive Director of the English Speaking Union, and I want to thank you for joining us this evening. I know our Evelyn Wrench Speaker Series has been struggling for the past 2 years with regard to the pandemic, and we are determined to launch again in the springtime, and I do apologize for any of our members or branches because we did try our hand at trying to launch something this fall. But I think what we have tonight is a very special event, and I want to thank Lord Charles Spencer for joining us this evening. I think this is going to be an exciting evening on a subject that I know I'm very fascinated by, and I know that you will be too. And The White Ship has been on the UK nonfiction bestseller list in London Times for 3 months. And it's a riveting storytelling of the disastrous shipwreck that claimed the life of King Henry I's only legitimate heir, William, and the subsequent challenges of Henry I's only legitimate daughter, Empress Matilda. And I hope you feel as I do, the women of this period are fascinating. And I'm really anxious to learn more about Empress Matilda. So, and in this lecture, Charles will take the audience on a spectacular journey into the past, exploring the historical consequences of the White Ship's ruin. There will be an audience Q&A at the end. So what I suggest is through the program, if you have any questions, please add them to the chat and the Q&A. And when Charles finishes his lecture, we'll be able to take some of those questions. Just so you know, Charles Spencer was educated at Eton and obtained his MA in modern history at Oxford. He is a historical journalist and the author of 8 nonfiction books, including 3 Sunday Times bestsellers, Blum, Battle for Europe, shortlisted for the History Book of the Year National Book Awards, Killers of the King, The Men Who Dared to Execute Charles I, and The White Ship. Lord Spencer also worked for NBC News in the United States and was an on-air correspondent from 1986 to 1995, primarily on the Today Show, but also on Sunday Today and NBC Nightly News. Thank you very much, Charles, and I look forward to hearing your lecture. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, what a pleasure to be part of this, and I'm a great fan of the English Speaking Union, and I'm delighted to be here. So yes, well, thank you for the introduction, and that's true, that's all correct, that's me. But why did I choose this story? Well, essentially, I'm not an academic historian, I'm more of a narrative historian, so I'm drawn to really interesting stories that I think shouldn't have been forgotten from the past, and that's really what I've written about over the last 25 years. And I try and draw on the wonderful education I was allowed to have as a young man, and one of the great stories is that of the White Ship. And it's one I've always known. You know, I'm in my late 50s now, and when I was a young boy in English schools, history was taught as a compulsory subject, and we were given a very broad base in these topics. Now, here, probably the same in America, I have no idea really, but it's all Hitler and Henry VIII and a few other things thrown in, and things like the White Ship and the early 12th century are specialist areas. And I suppose we all think there are certain things in our life which we know and therefore everyone knows, and it's not the case. And that was brought home to me about 5 years ago. There's a very successful historian and historical fiction writer over here called Alison Weir. And Alison had kindly written a nice review about one of my previous books. And I was sitting here, I'm at Althorpe, my family's home. It's a historic house we've lived in since 1508. And I was working at my desk one day 5 years ago when Alison called and said, "What are you doing this evening?" And I went, "Well, not much." And she went, "Well, I need you to be at Leeds Castle in 4 hours' time giving a lecture on the Queens of England." So I got in my car and gave a lecture. And as I was driving to this place, Leeds Castle, one of the magnificent buildings of England, I thought, you know, they'll know this audience. Actually, it was of Americans visiting England. They're all historical fans. I knew they'd know as much as me about Elizabeth I and Victoria and, you know, Anne Boleyn and all the obvious candidates. So I threw in a rogue card. Empress Matilda, who was in the 1120s destined to be Queen of England, but was cruelly denied that opportunity. And to get her into context, I had to tell the story of the White Ship. And it was astonishing to me, actually, to see the reaction. First of all, it was quite clear to me that very few people in the room had heard of the White Ship, which is totally understandable. But secondly, that they thought it was quite an interesting tale. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, I was looking up this tale, which has always intrigued me. And I suddenly noticed that the 900th anniversary was coming up last November. And I went to my publishers and I said, "Look, I think this is a really interesting story." And I think they struggled a little bit with the idea of something from the 12th century they hadn't heard of being an interesting story. And I said, "Listen, this is basically Titanic meets Game of Thrones with a little bit of sliding doors thrown into it." And they went, "Well, go and write it then." So I did. And what I try and do when I write these books is to hang the reader's hat on things that they can depend on. So we are talking about events that emanated from 1066 and the Norman conquest of England. And I want to lead you, first of all, to a person and a boat. William the Conqueror himself. He didn't believe he was the conqueror, and in fact, he wasn't given that nickname for some time after his death. He was known by his enemies and his detractors as William the Bastard. He was illegitimate, and as a young boy, he had become Duke of Normandy. But he was second cousin to Edward the Confessor, a childless king, Anglo-Saxon king of England, who died in early 1066 and was succeeded by King Harold. But William the Conqueror was sure that the crown of England was his by right. So he assembled an invasion force from Normandy, and the main port where his ships were built and prepared was a place called Barfleur. And his ship his flagship was given to him as a surprise present by his adoring wife. And she gave it to him and said, "This is called the Mora, M-O-R-A." And we're not quite sure why it is called that. You'll see it on the Bayeux tapestry. But essentially, they had a very strong love match, quite unusual at this time. William the Conqueror was a very pious man. There's no sign of illegitimate children and all the usual paraphernalia of this time among the ruling classes. And we think that Mora was an anagram of the Latin amor, for love. So this is a ship that is the prime invading ship in 1066. And it carried William the Conqueror and his henchmen over to England. And of course, we know what happened in 1066 with the Battle of Hastings and the subsequent subjugation of England. It wasn't as straightforward as one battle, but it happened over time. And William the Conqueror is the backdrop to this tale, as is the Mora. And we follow him at the beginning of the book as a man of huge potential who seizes his chance, becomes King of England, rewards those who've invested in his venture, and sires a large family, 9 or 10 children, we're not quite sure, but he has 4 sons. The eldest is called Robert. William the Conqueror has a difficult relationship with his eldest son. There's an element of the old stag and the young buck about this relationship. William the Conqueror probably set this in motion because when he set off on the invasion, he elevated his son in case he didn't come back, in case he failed in his venture. And Robert Curthose expected to be treated with huge respect after that point. But to be honest, he didn't have a huge amount of respect from his father. Robert Curthose was a young man of limited height. Curthose means short trousers, essentially. It was a cruel nickname thought up by the conqueror to belittle his son. And there were three other sons. One we lose sight of quite early. He's called Richard. He dies as a teenager in a hunting accident in England. The second son is William Rufus, who is a sort of swaggering soldier, quite an irreligious figure, but a very fine military man and somebody that William the Conqueror looks at as a man who can do a job militarily. And then the youngest son is Henry I, who is really the tragic hero of the White Ship. And he probably was cut out for a life in the church. He was given a bishop as his tutor. He was considered a bit of an intellectual in his family. William the Conqueror was not an intellectual. He was a man of action. He tried to learn to speak English or Anglo-Saxon English. He couldn't do it. But he was busy. He was a busy man fighting his battles. None of the sons, apart from Henry, were literate. And Henry actually could only read, he couldn't write. But he was known as Henry Beauclerk later, which basically means the good scholar. Henry was very upset in 1087. First of all, because William the Conqueror had reached late middle age as a corpulent figure who was fighting endless civil wars against his eldest son. And in a melee, William the Conqueror had received a crippling blow in his stomach from the pommel on the front of his saddle. And this caused a rupture inside of him, which was clearly, after a while, killing him. And as he lay on his deathbed, he was tended particularly by Henry. And Henry listened to his father's thoughts as he died. And William the Conqueror shared with his youngest surviving son the idea that he was going to, even though he didn't like him, he was going to leave Normandy to his eldest son, Robert. This was really to placate the great Norman barons. They didn't want a divided succession in their prime territory. But William the Conqueror insisted that he leave England, the prize that he had won by himself, by his own merit, that he could leave that to who he wanted to, and he left that to William Rufus, because I think, first of all, William Rufus was his favorite son, but secondly, as I mentioned before, he was a military figure, and holding on to England was not easy. There were a lot of, we tend to think when we look back that that was sort of it, you know, the Normans won it, and therefore they had England for a very long time. But this isn't the case at all. There were a lot of people who wanted to take England off the Normans' hands. And then William the Conqueror gave Henry the very bad news that he wasn't going to give him any lands at all. He was going to give him a large amount of silver. And Henry was upset, and he said, look, you know, I'm the one here at your deathbed. I'm the one who's looked after you, and this is what I'm getting. And William the Conqueror said to him, one day you'll be greater than both your brothers. Now, William the Conqueror died. I know it's the early evening with you. You probably haven't eaten, but I'm going to have to share with you the gruesome details of William the Conqueror's funeral. William, who had been a very robust, strong, strapping young man. There are stories about him being able to bend longbows fully back that other men couldn't make any impression on. He was an incredibly powerful physical force. But by this stage, he'd become a rather overweight man. And at his funeral in Rouen, there was this extraordinary scene where the monks were trying to get this rather large corpse into a small sarcophagus, a carved coffin. And they couldn't get William in. He was just too big. And they were wrestling with trying to get him in to this container when the conqueror's stomach burst open. And he had been lying in state for some time, and the smell was so appalling that people rushed out of the cathedral in disgust, and the very few monastic figures who stayed behind managed somehow to see the funeral through. After this, Henry I had a very tough few years. I mean, his brothers decided to take everything off him that they could. Henry had quickly invested in property in the west of Normandy and had various dominions, really, including Mont Saint-Michel, the sort of monastery that is accessible at low tide off the coast of Brittany. But the two brothers, Robert and William, took these off him. They used him as a pawn in their own battles amongst each other. They even imprisoned him at one point. And he had a rather bizarre life as a young man, where he was much underestimated. He was just seen as this aristocratic appendage to the royal family, and not much was expected to happen with him. But in 1100, he was with his brother William Rufus when they were both on a hunting trip in the south of England in the New Forest. And in somewhat mysterious circumstances, William Rufus was shot through the heart during this hunting trip. And Henry was there. People at the time did not see him as guilty of this, but nobody's ever established who fired that arrow. The one man who fled the country and took the blame clearly didn't do it. He was in the wrong part of the forest. Anyway, we have William Rufus lying dead on the floor of the forest in the south of England, and Henry seizing his opportunity. He rides first to Winchester, which is the great capital of the Anglo-Saxons, and seizes the treasury there. And then he rides on to London and is crowned at Westminster Abbey. And then he has to do various things that are expected of a medieval monarch. He has to establish order, and equally importantly, he has to produce an heir. And very early on in his reign, in 1100, Henry decides to marry a princess of Scotland who has ancient English blood. And she is called Princess Matilda of Scotland. And she is actually the daughter of the man, King Malcolm, who kills the real life Macbeth. And I love, when I'm writing these books, to look at these figures from history who resonate with us, but not necessarily in a full way. So what I found when I was researching this book is that Macbeth was not the henpecked, neurotic, useless king of Scotland that Shakespeare has handed down to us, but actually a highly successful, intelligent, and accomplished ruler. He brought about legislation in Scotland for the protection of widows and orphans. He was rich and powerful enough to leave the rule of Scotland with others while he traveled to Rome, and he impressed the people of Rome with his great generosity to the poor. And yes, he lost in battle and was beheaded. But anyway, his defeating force, the man who killed him, Malcolm, it was his daughter who attracted Henry I's eye. And they married. It was apparently a love match. It's difficult with the chroniclers at this time because they tend to glorify people in the royal family to an extraordinary extent. But it seems to have been a love match, and children soon appeared, 2 of them. The elder was the Empress Matilda. Obviously, she wasn't born an empress, but she was traded on the international marriage market and became the Empress of Germany, like the Holy Roman Empress would be the full title. And this was wonderful validation for Henry. He was essentially a usurper. He had seized the throne that wasn't his on his brother's accidental death, while his eldest brother, Robert Curthose, was distracted on the First Crusade. And then there was a second child a couple of years later, and that was the one legitimate son from this union, and he was called William Atheling. Atheling is really the equivalent of the Prince of Wales. It means the next king. And these were the 2. Henry I remains Britain's most fertile monarch in terms of the children he produced. He had 22 illegitimate children, which quite unusually he acknowledged and rewarded and used, actually. He used them as bargaining counters on the diplomatic table of Europe, marrying them off to various lords and princes to try and build up his influence abroad. So that was one thing he had to do. The other was to establish order. And I really like Henry as a king. Henry I was one of the great kings of England. His most spectacular achievement was financial. He had expensive wars to fight. He had laws that he wanted to see put into action. And he knew that the key to all of this, the cornerstone of everything, was finance. The Normans inherited in England the best financial system in Europe in terms of the coinage. The Anglo-Saxon coins were known for their purity and the way in which the rulers made sure that the coins weren't messed about with. You know, if you picked up an Anglo-Saxon coin, it had a certain percentage of silver in it that you could rely on. Henry I was very clear. He told the 50 or 60 men around the kingdom who had the license to mint coins, you have this and it's a privilege. If you mess around with my coinage, I will treat it as treason. And the great gift of Henry I is one that's hard to appreciate from 900 years distance. But essentially, he was a very hard man. And the cruelty that we see in him from this distance is rather irrelevant, because the people, his subjects, were absolutely happy to have a cruel monarch ruling them if in return they had peace and freedom. And the great myth of the time of Henry I is that a young girl with a purse full of gold could walk from one end of the kingdom to the other without being molested. Henry made an example of those who didn't toe the line. One day at Easter, he invited several of the people who were licensed to mint coins to come and join him at Windsor Castle. They thought this was going to be a great privilege, but they were the ones who had been spotted as playing around with the silver content of the coins. And they were, I'm afraid, castrated and had their right hands cut off. And this was Henry's way. He ruled through terrifying example. There is a Game of Thrones element to this. I mean, he really was appalling when it came to cruelty, but it did mean that he could stamp out any dissent. And essentially, during his reign of 35 years, after the first couple of years where he had to take on some of the very powerful aristocrats, he had a settled kingdom. 6 years into his reign, he had decided to extend his influence beyond England. He was very upset with the appalling rule of his eldest brother, Robert, in Normandy. Normandy had sunk into chaos. Robert Curthose was an accomplished crusader. He had done well in the Holy Land, but with his own territories, he was a terrible ruler. And people were in a state of anarchy under his rule. So Henry invaded Normandy effectively with a mercenary army and some soldiers from England. And there was a pitched battle in 1106, which Henry decisively won. And he committed his elder brother, Robert, to prison for the rest of his very long life. So now we have Henry I has established his rule in England and Normandy, and he has an heir. He also has an absolutely dedicated enemy. The King of France, called Louis the Fat, was an able king, and he was very aware that the biggest threat to him, both in his lifetime and in the future for France, was having this terrible alliance under Henry I and his family between the Viking Normans. You know, Normandy as a province had been carved out by Viking raiders as a piecemeal sop to them to stop them invading and pillaging France. And at the same time, England was incredibly wealthy with its exports and its products of all sorts, particularly wool. and that the wealth allied to the Norman steel was France's greatest nightmare. And so Henry, for the first 20 years of his reign, from 1100 to 1120, spent most of his time fighting the King of France, trying to get him to recognize his son, William Atheling, as the heir to the dukedom of Normandy. And particularly between the years 1116 and 1120, there were 4 years of complete bloodshed between the English and the French, trying to establish the right of this. And in 1119, Henry I won a great battle, which saw Louis the Fat finally acknowledge openly that William Atheling would be Duke of Normandy. And this brings us to the crux of this book, the actual white ship. So in 1120, in November, so 901 years ago to this evening, within 2 weeks of this evening anyway, Henry arrives at Barfleur, the harbor I've mentioned earlier, where the Mora was built in time for the Norman conquest. And as he arrives, ready to set sail on the 10 or 12-hour journey north to Southampton on the English coast, a man comes forward and he says to Henry I, he says, "Sire, it was my father's great honor to be the captain of the Mora, and he took your father to England in 1066 in the moment of his greatest triumph. And now you've had the moment of your greatest triumph, defeating the French and having your son recognized. It would be my great honor to take you back to England in the white ship." And he points to the white ship and he says, "This is a wonderful vessel." And it is white. White was a color of celebration among the Vikings and Normans. And it was huge. We know that the Mora had perhaps 16 oarsmen on board. The white ship had 50. It was a very large vessel capable of carrying a large number of people across the channel. And Henry I is a rather stern and unflatterable man. And he says, "Well, it's wonderful, your ship, but I've made my arrangements and I'm going to go back to England on my usual ship. But I have to admit, the white ship is magnificent. And why don't you take my one legitimate son, some of my illegitimate children, my great generals, the ladies of the court, the military generals who have done so well in these campaigns, and also my treasure chest, the royal treasure chest. These can all go in the white ship." And then Henry set sail for England, as he's planned to do, the evening of the 25th of November, 1120. And he leaves his son and the retinue who he attracts to take their own time to come across in the white ship. And these young people, on the whole, get massively drunk on wine. They encourage the crew to join in the excess. And they do something which, in this very superstitious religious age, was seen as an act of sheer folly. When men of God come to bless the vessel, because people were very scared of long voyages at this time, and they relied on Christianity to make them feel safer. When these monks appeared to bless the white ship, drunken passengers on board thought it was very amusing to chase them away. So the white ship was unblessed. And then just before midnight on the 25th of November, 901 years ago, the ship, the white ship, pushes out to sea. And suddenly somebody, one of the drunken passengers, has this wonderful idea. Why don't we try and beat the king back to England? Even though he's had a few hours head start, let's try to do it. And the 50 oarsmen of the white ship bend their backs. And then the captain is drunk and he loses his bearings and he drops, he makes the sail come into action far too soon. While Barfleur is a perfect harbor, the coast along that part of Normandy, it's very near to where Omaha Beach is, it's a rocky coastline. You do not use your sail until you're clear of the rocks. But the combination of the drink and the speed of the oarsmen and the sail being dropped disorientates the helmsman, and he lets the white ship hit the main obstacle outside the harbor, which is the key berth rock. It's still there, of course. And everyone screams. The people on shore hear that scream, but to be honest, they think it's just the party has reached a higher notch of excitement. They are unconcerned and they go to bed. But meanwhile, carnage is happening on the white ship. The crew don't realize how bad the wound is in the side of the vessel, and they use oars and pikes to push off from the key berth rock, which only makes the gash in the side of the white ship ever wider. People start tumbling into the sea. But there is one lifeboat, and the prince's bodyguards push him into it and start rowing to safety on the shore. At this stage, William, the prince, hears a voice amongst all the others, but it's higher and it reaches him. And it's that of one of his half-sisters, the Countess of Perche. And she is calling for him to come back to save her. And he decides to order the crew of the lifeboat to turn around and go and get her. And this they do, but people can't swim. This is an age when very, very, very few people can swim. It was not a pastime. It was something that people might have learned to do if they were involved in fishing and had to retrieve nets. And as they saw, these drowning people saw this possible salvation in the shape of a small rowing boat. They clambered onto it and took it down, and the prince drowned with them. And how do we know this? Well, we know it because at this stage there was a handful of people still alive. On a broken mast was a butcher called Barreau. He was from Rouen, the Norman capital, and he got on the white ship to essentially get his debts paid. He was worried that a lot of people who owed him money were disappearing across the channel and he might never see them again. And he was probably the humblest passenger on board. But he had scrambled on this mast and he saw things unfurling around him. And beside him was one of Henry I's great knights, a man called de l'Aigle. Now, their survival prospects were quite different because de l'Aigle was a nobleman and he was dressed in silks with fine animal skins, probably wolf skins on him to keep him warm. And these were saturated and he became very cold. And through the night, he got worse and worse. And it's quite clear from Barreau's account that de l'Aigle suffered from hypothermia. And before the morning came, he slipped into the sea and died. But Barreau, I think, possibly because of what he was wearing, survived. You know, he was out of the water on top of this piece of broken mast. And he was wearing the offcuts of his trade, sheepskin and goatskin. And even if they're wet, as long as you're out of the water, those will absorb heat and keep you alive. Come the morning, the only survivor of the white ship was Barreau, and he was found drifting on his broken mast by fishermen from Barfleur. And then the great question came, who was going to tell Henry I what had happened? He was a ferocious figure, Henry, and nobody wanted to be that messenger. And it took a couple of days before one of Henry's nephews persuaded a page boy to tell the king what had happened. The court couldn't keep the secret any longer. So many of them had lost friends and relatives in the disaster, and they were finding it very hard to hide their grief from the king. We know that when the boy told the king, he bellowed in agony and disbelief and fell to the floor and had to be carried to his bedchamber. He then was confronted with devastating personal loss, but also a dynastic existential crisis. This is a period when the church had re-established control over the royalty and aristocracy of Europe. The papacy had brought about the Crusades partly to resurrect the reverence that people had for the papacy itself. And they had also established the basic tenets of Christian law again. And this meant that, unlike William the Conqueror, who had been able, as a young man, to become the ruler of Normandy, because even though he was illegitimate, this was not possible anymore. and the church insisted that nobody could become an heir if they were illegitimate. So essentially, we have Henry I without the one son who could succeed him. The 22 illegitimate children were irrelevant in terms of the succession because they could not succeed. And Henry was left with a daughter, Matilda, the Empress in Germany, who wasn't considered an heir at this point. And Henry, after 2 or 3 months of the disaster, he was a widower at this time, remarried a young girl and kept her by his side, but no other children resulted from this second marriage. We don't know why, because after Henry's death, that bride went on to remarry and she had 6 children, but something meant that Henry was unable to father children with her. After a few years, the Empress Matilda's husband died of cancer, and she was a widow, and she became a very valuable commodity. And essentially, 5 miles from where I'm sitting right now, in Northampton Castle, Henry summoned the great men of England, the bishops and the barons, and he made them all swear in front of him that they would acknowledge Matilda as his successor. And this they all did. They actually fought each other to be the first to proclaim her as the successor. But 15 years after the White Ship's disastrous loss, Henry died of the most unlikely of causes. He suffered from what they called a surfeit of lampreys. It essentially meant he ate too many oily eels one dinner, and it upset his stomach so badly that he died. And at that stage, people did not turn, as they had promised to his daughter Matilda, but they allowed a nephew of Henry I to steal the throne. And he was called Stephen. Stephen bolted across the channel and seized the crown of England. And a fascinating footnote to Stephen is that he was actually originally on the White Ship, but while the White Ship was waiting to set off for England on its doomed voyage, he suffered from a stomach upset. And rather than have the embarrassment and discomfort of that on a channel crossing, he got off the White Ship and survived. Otherwise, of course, he would have been among the drowned. So we have the White Ship bookending this sort of final decades of the Norman dynasty, because the essential point of the White Ship, why it really, really matters, is because it saw the end of the Norman dynasty. In 1120, when the heir to the throne died, there were plans for Matilda to succeed, but these came to nothing when Henry I died. And Stephen ruled from 1135 to 1154, even though Matilda, the Empress, challenged him in the most bloody of civil wars to take the throne off him. That did not happen. And so essentially on that shipwreck, on the Key Berth Rock, William the Conqueror's Norman dynasty came to an end. And it's because of that loss, that night, 901 years ago, that England's history changed forever. We didn't have the Normans anymore. We had the Plantagenets. They came in and took control. And they stayed on the English throne for over 300 years until the Tudors took over. So essentially, because of the White Ship disaster, which is considered the worst maritime disaster that's ever happened to Britain, the course of history was changed forever. If you look at the cast of historical figures on the British throne that we know so well, whether it's King John conceding Magna Carta, whether it's Henry V at Agincourt, Henry VIII with his 6 wives, even Elizabeth II now, none of these people would have become kings or queens of Europe, of this European country, if off the coast of Normandy, the White Ship hadn't gone down 901 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. We will now be taking questions. You can enter the questions in to either the Q&A module or the chat module, either of which can be found at the bottom of your Zoom screens. We do have one question already. An amazing story. Can Charles Spencer comment on his sources and research?
Yes, I mean, my last 4 books were on the Stuarts, who, particularly on the English Civil War in the 1640s. And when I'm researching that period, there are literally thousands of primary sources because you have a thriving printing press with propaganda sheets and news sheets, etc. That is not the case. At 900 years distance, I was limited to 9 primary sources, and they were all Christian. They were all written by monks, one by a nun actually, but by religious folk. And that was very interesting because I'm used to, you know, dealing with a period as partisan as the 1640s, where you've got 2 sides who really loathe each other. You end up with this extraordinary situation where the bias is Christian, and it's a very particular brand of Christianity. So these monks and this nun really do believe that every single thing that happens to people in the world is down to God. And it's not for those who are watching who understand Christianity, it is not this is not a New Testament God. It's a very forbidding, powerful, deeply threatening Old Testament God who smites you down. And that is the real nub here, because I have to pick that out and look for what really did happen. There is an incredibly good source. I mean, there are several, but the one that really stuck out for me is a man called Orderic Vitalis, an extraordinary name, but he was an English-born Norman monk. So he started life as a boy in the northwest of England. His father was a very religious man, and he believed that it was his duty as a Christian who cared for the soul of his son to send that son to a particular monastery in Normandy. And through the loss of his son to the family, that son would gain an eternal place in heaven. And luckily for people who care about this period, Orderic Vitalis really desperately cared about things he heard about in England because of his English roots. So he recorded an enormous amount to do with the White Ship disaster. And it's quite clear to me, I mean, I'll never be able to prove this, but it's quite clear to me that he spoke at length to Barreau the butcher, because this is an eyewitness account written and recorded by a monk. So, you know, we think, how is it possible? But it was, these are intact. These monasteries preserved their records, and people were stunned by the loss of the heir to the English throne in this bizarre shipwreck.
Our next question is, has the White Ship's shipwreck been found? And if not, is there currently a search for it?
There has been a search for it. So I was actually there in June, I think it was, and it's off the Keyberth Rock. Look, I don't know. I mean, the divers went down, they found a piece of timber under the mud, which the people in charge of the dive said was looks very much like a part of the White Ship. But to be honest, you know, until that piece of wood is out of there, which would need the French government's permission because it's just off the coast of France, and until it's really diagnosed, you know, the thing is, there must have been a lot of shipwrecks in that area, so we don't know. Intriguing that it is the right period. Apparently, they say it is early 12th century. I would love, even if it was a rivet or a nail to be found, I'd love that, because it's such an incredible. It is the Titanic of its day. It would be wonderful to have even a tiny vestige of it, but nothing has been verifiably proved to be of the White Ship.
Next question is from Sarah Berry, who asks, did Matilda marry Geoffrey of Anjou after she became a widow? And did Stephen agree to have their son Henry ascend the throne after he died?
So yes, the Empress Matilda was very keen on being an empress. She liked the status, and when her husband died, he died of cancer. This left Henry I, her father, with a viable prospect of a successor. And Henry was very pragmatic, and he asked his daughter to marry a prince, well, a count, who was half her age, effectively. Geoffrey of Anjou was a beautiful young man, that is clear from the chronicles, but he had a very unfortunate manner. She didn't really want to downgrade from an empress to a countess. It's quite a steep drop for her, but she did want to obey her father. So she married Geoffrey reluctantly. They had a very, very tricky marriage. They didn't like each other. They did have 3 sons. The eldest of these was called Henry, after his grandfather. And interestingly, he was to become the first Plantagenet king of England. So essentially, and I didn't really go into this, but I'm happy to do so now. The civil war that took place between Stephen and Matilda after the death of Henry I went on for 19 years, and it was incredibly bloody and unpleasant. People wrote about how God and the saints had forgotten England during this period. They also commented on how England seemed awash with blood. It really was, you know, I don't need to tell Americans how bloody civil wars can be, but it really was an appalling conflict. And it reached a sort of an impasse where nobody was going to win. And the churchmen and the leading nobility said, look, we've got to bring this to an end. So the way they did this was they said to Stephen, who wasn't a good king, you can remain on the throne, but when you die, your children are not going to succeed. Matilda's son, Henry, will succeed. And this is what happened. Now, the Plantagenets are a rather extraordinary family, and they ruled Anjou, this chunk of what is now France. But they were considered very odd even at that time, and they were particularly noted for appalling tempers. And just to give you a flavor of Henry II, who became another one of the greatest kings of England, a great force in Europe as a whole, but he was a very jealous man. He was a very angry, active man. They said he never sat down except when he was in the saddle of his horse or to eat. And the rest of the time he was restless and furious and very jealous. And somebody once complimented a rival king, the King of Scotland, in front of him. And they said Henry II was so furious with jealousy that he started to eat his own mattress on his bed. So a very complicated bunch. And they were said to be, of course they weren't, but they were said to be descended from a daughter of the devil. But they, you know, they were effective, and they were the ultimate winners out of the White Ship tragedy.
Our next question is from Patricia Cz, who says, I find Alison Weir's writings about women of the early period of the White Ship intriguing. Did you use any of her books? You are a wonderful storyteller. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Alison, I love Alison. I love her writing. I didn't actually know she had written about this period, to be honest. So no, I didn't, but not because if I had known, I probably would have, you know. Secondary sources, you have to be careful of. It's a very easy, if you're writing books, I tend to take 3 years to write a book, but if you want to write them quicker than that, it would be very easy to use a lot of other people's work and shovel them into your own. I try to do as much primary research as I can first. And I enjoy Alison's writing. I like her historical writing. I don't know her historical fiction writing, because I'm not a big historical fiction reader. But there are all sorts of people who have written about this period. Ken Follett, who's one of our greatest authors over here, has written historical fiction around the White Ship and this period of the anarchy, which is the period between, it's the period of the Civil War between Stephen and Matilda. So it is a period of history that has inspired very able historical fiction writers to have a go, because it's such a dramatic period. It's a good backdrop for a story if you're writing historical fiction, I'd imagine.
So our next question is from Bill Goodman, who asked, please comment on the circumstances of Stephen being released from prison in an 1141 prisoner exchange.
Yes, well, the 19 years of civil war reached, as I say, they reach an impasse. But in their early years, it's a very much a roller coaster effect of who's going to win this conflict. So really, it's only in 1138 that Matilda arrives, Empress Matilda arrives with an army in the south coast of England and makes some progress. She's an incredibly interesting woman in her own right. She had a lot of the steel and stamina of her grandfather, William the Conqueror, and I think she would have made a very good queen. You know, the fact that she didn't become one was largely down to the fact that England wasn't ready for a queen in her own right. They wanted kings. And this is a reflection of the barons of the time wanting to see their leader as a warrior. And because of the rather blinkered way they viewed life at this time, the barons couldn't see a woman leading them into battle. But I would like to point out, before I fully answer that question, you know, how very brave Matilda was. There was a period during one winter where she was going to lose the war because she was going to be captured. And she was in a castle at Oxford, and there was snow on the ground. Her garrison were on the point of mutiny. She was surrounded by King Stephen's troops, and she draped herself in a white cloak and took her two closest knights, who she trusted most, in the same disguise, and they let themselves down the wall of the castle at Oxford and went through the snow in their white capes, disguised camouflaged against the snow, and got away. King Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141 and was kept prisoner. And it seemed at that point that Matilda had won the war. But then, unfortunately for her, King Stephen had an incredibly able wife. A lot of very strong women in this story. And she was Matilde of Boulogne. She was actually a cousin of Matilda's. And she managed to keep the campaign going on behalf of her husband while he was in prison. And while she resurrected the campaign of her imprisoned king husband, they captured Matilda's greatest general, who was also a half brother of Matilda. He was one of King Henry I's very able illegitimate sons. He was the Earl of Gloucester. And so essentially, there was a prisoner swap that had to take place. Matilda could not keep the war going without her very successful, brilliant, illegitimate half-brother. So she had to let the king go, King Stephen go, in a prisoner swap. And that kept the war going for another decade or so. So it's a very interesting war, because every time you think that it's reached a conclusive point, something surprising happens on the other side, which keeps it going, gives it extra energy.
So our next question is from Katie Brill, who asks, in regards to your sources, as to where you found them: libraries, monasteries?
Well, I use a lot of libraries. I haven't been to monasteries for this. I haven't used the actual original documents. They're so precious, but there are manuscript copies of them, and I have used them. I spent a lot of my time in the London Library, which has, well, I can't remember how many miles of books. It's a rather wonderful setup, and they have an enormous amount of sources there. I do a lot of my research online using documents that are available to the public online. And yeah, I didn't have the need to go to monasteries. So it's a good question, but the 9 sources I have are so famous, so revered, that the copies of them are readily available.
So I think, as a fitting final question to the Q&A portion, Donald Patillo of our Atlanta branch asks, what next?
Well, I like stories, as I mentioned, and so I'm doing something very 20th century. So normally I'm doing the 17th century. Here I am doing the 12th century. And I realized that actually what really counts, what really connects with the reader is a really first-rate story. And I have found one in the 20th century. My publishers won't allow me to say what it is. And I think that's because I tend to find anniversaries of things that need to be brought to life, I guess. And I suppose they worry that if I say it, then someone else will write it and probably do a better job. I'm sure that's what their real worry is. So I can't actually say what it is, but I would say it is thrilling and it's nearly done actually. And yeah, it's been a labor of love. I've really enjoyed doing it. So to me, the bottom line on all of this is I'm not constrained by time periods or eras. I enjoy finding a really, really interesting story to me, which I hope I can transmit the excitement of that story to others.
I'll now invite Karen back on to the screen.
Thank you so much, Charles. Again, I do extend an invitation to you the next time you're in New York or in the United States. We would love to have you visit us, meet some of our branches, because I think this was a wonderful lecture and very, very, very entertaining, and at the same time, very educational. Thank you again. And thank you everyone who attended tonight. Please join us in the springtime when our Evelyn Wrench program will be starting up again in person. In the meantime, if you are a patron member, we are having an event tomorrow night with the International Churchill Society, a kind of fun evening, testing your knowledge on Churchill. So please join us, any of our patron members. And then of course, our gala on January 12th, where we'll be joined by our president, our honorary president, Princess Anne, in New York, January 12th at the Cosmopolitan Club. So join us. Thank you again and have a beautiful evening. Thank you.